April 7, 1945. The wind is cold, and the sea is unnervingly calm as you stand atop the deck of the colossal battleship Yamato, a war machine so immense and so heavily armed that it was once believed no force on Earth could bring it to its knees. 72,000 tons of steel shaped into a floating fortress, carrying guns the size of small trees, weapons capable of throwing explosive shells farther than entire cities stretch. Japan had built Yamato as a symbol of unbreakable might. Yet on this morning, you feel something else lingering in the air. Dread. The horizon begins to darken. At first, the shapes seem like distant birds, black silhouettes drifting in the pale sky. But in minutes the truth becomes clear. Not birds. Not clouds. Aircraft, hundreds of them, swarming like an angry storm that has come to drag Yamato beneath the sea. And within 2 hours, this titan, along with nearly 3,000 men, will vanish forever beneath the waves in one of the deadliest aerial naval attacks in human history. This is the tale of Operation Tengo, Japan's final, forbidden gamble, and the American pilots who turned the Pacific into a steel graveyard. The Pacific, 1945. A WAR bleeding itself dry. By early 1945, the Pacific theater had turned into a grinding machine, swallowing ships, planes, and soldiers with relentless brutality. Japan's once terrifying navy, proud, disciplined, legendary, had been reduced to a battered remnant. Midway shattered their carriers. The Philippine Sea erased their air power. Lake Gulf hammered away what little remained. The empire was cornered. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. Shipyards were crippled, and the Americans were now approaching Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan's home islands. Every Japanese leader knew the meaning of that. Lose Okinawa, and the doorway to invasion stood wide open. Emperor Hirohito himself voiced the question everyone feared. What of the Navy? What aid will they give to defend Okinawa? Do we have nothing left to send? There was one answer, one ship still capable of fighting. And it was both desperate and tragic. They would send Yamato, and they would send her to die. A mission without return. Operation Tengo was less a strategy and more a ritual suicide. The plan required Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers to steam toward Okinawa with just enough fuel to reach the battlefield. Not enough to return home. There would be no friendly aircraft overhead, no backup plan, no path to survival. Their objective was heartbreakingly simple. Fight through the American fleet. Beach Yamato on Okinawa itself. Turn her enormous guns into coastal artillery. And then, as food, ammunition, and hope ran dry. Fight until every last man was dead. The task force was the naval equivalent of the kamikaze. A sacrifice the commanders knew would achieve almost nothing. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito protested with everything he had. He called the mission wasteful, delusional, and unforgivable. He argued, pleaded, and reasoned. But refusal was not an option. Orders had been sealed, and Japan's military hierarchy had no space left for doubt. When the officers finally explained the mission to the crew, the reaction was devastating. Some young sailors cried openly. Many reached for bottles of sake and drank through the night. A handful, the sick and the barely trained cadets, were ordered off the ship before departure. Everyone else stayed. Not a single man asked to withdraw. On April 6th, shortly before midnight, Yamato and her escorts were given fuel, far more than what had been authorized. The men at the fueling depot, defying orders, secretly filled them with almost every remaining drop the facility had. It was not enough to live. It was only enough to die with dignity. At dawn, the fleet slipped through the Bongo Strait and turned south. The sky was gray, the water smooth as a mirror. But the Americans were already waiting. Teach U.S. Navy knows everything. Japan did not realize that their codes had long been compromised. American cryptographers had intercepted and decoded Tengo before Yamato even left harbor. 2 U.S. submarines, USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback, shadowed the Japanese ships through the night, quietly transmitting their location. When the morning sun rose on April 7th, every American admiral in the region knew exactly what was coming. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, briefly considered sending 6 mighty U.S. battleships to intercept Yamato for a titanic, ship-to-ship duel. It would have been the last great battleship fight in world history. But Admiral Mark Mitcher, leader of the legendary Task Force 58, made a colder, more modern calculation. Why risk American sailors when planes could destroy her from beyond the horizon? Spruance agreed. The era of battleship duels ended that morning. The carriers took over. THESKY darkens. THE attack begins. At exactly 10 a.m., 16 American carriers from task groups 58.1, 58.3, and 58.4 began launching the largest single airstrike ever assembled in the Pacific War. Over 300 aircraft, Hellcats, Corsairs, Helldivers, Avengers, climbed into the sky in coordinated waves. Their single destination, Yamato. Aboard the battleship, sailors were already at action stations. Anti-aircraft gunners stood at their weapons, eyes strained toward the horizon. At 8:23 that morning, 2 American flying boats appeared at long range, circling like patient wolves. Yamato fired her monstrous anti-aircraft shells, towering clouds of steel darts exploding in the sky. But the planes stayed out of range, calmly reporting every move. At 10 a.m., radar screens filled with blips. Dozens. Then hundreds. Just after 11 a.m., the first American fighters appeared, Hellcats and Corsairs, charged with sweeping away Japanese aircraft. But there were none. Japan had promised 6 fighters as escort. They never arrived. Yamato was alone. At 12:30 p.m., the storm arrived. Wave ONE. THE first hammer falls. Nearly 300 American aircraft descended at once, an avalanche of engines, metal, and flame. The destroyer Asashimo, struggling with engine failure, found herself isolated. She was ripped apart in minutes. 330 sailors vanished into the sea. Then the Americans turned toward the Titan. Fighter pilots roared and low, hosing Yamato's decks with relentless machine gun fire to suppress Japanese gunners. Helldivers then plunged in nearly vertical dives, releasing half-ton bombs that smashed into the superstructure, tearing open steel like paper. And then came the torpedo planes, Avengers, gliding low across the waves, releasing torpedoes aimed deliberately at Yamato's port side. The Americans had learned from the sinking of her sister ship, Musashi. Hit one side heavily, flood the ship unevenly, force her to capsize. Yamato twisted violently in the water, her captain trying every maneuver he could think of. The sky was filled with tracers, 162 rapid-fire guns, plus the 6 dual 5-inch mounts, lighting the air with desperate fury. But the Americans kept coming. They flew through fire and explosions as though pulled by destiny. By 12:45, Yamato had already been struck multiple times. 2 torpedoes, 2 bombs. Fires erupted along her decks. Water rushed into compartments. But the giant still lived, and so the Americans returned. Wave TWO. Yahagi falls. Yamato begins TODI. 1 o'clock. Another wave. More bombs. More torpedoes. The light cruiser Yahagi, leading the formation, took a brutal hit in her engine room. Power vanished. She drifted helplessly. Minutes later, she was torn apart by additional strikes. Destroyers suffered too. Hamikaze exploded violently. Suzutsuki was blasted by a massive bomb that ignited her magazine, killing dozens instantly. And Yamato, the great ship, reeled from hit after hit. 3 more torpedoes slammed into her port side. Internal compartments flooded rapidly. Sailors drowned behind sealed watertight doors. Above deck, men slipped on pools of blood and seawater as explosions flung bodies across steel plating. But still she floated. Still she fought. Wave 3. Teach final blows. At 1:40 p.m., the third and deadliest wave descended. Torpedo bombers approached from every angle, determined to cripple Yamato's steering. If she couldn't maneuver, she would die. Their aim was devastatingly accurate. At 2 p.m., Yamato's steering failed entirely. She began to spiral in a slow, helpless circle. Water surged in. The list to port grew steeper. Vice Admiral Ito stood on the bridge, watching the deck angle rise, watching his men struggle against the impossible. He knew the battle was finished. 10 minutes later, he gave the final order. Cancel the operation. Save whoever can be saved. But almost no one could be saved. The decks tilted sharply. Counter-flooding operations failed. Men slid across the deck, grabbing rails, tumbling into the sea. Captain Aruga lashed himself to the binnacle, determined to die at his post. Admiral Ito retreated to his cabin and prepared to share the ship's fate. At 2:20 p.m., with the ship already on her side, the abandoned ship order finally spread. But most of the crew was already trapped below. Watertight doors had locked them in. Flooded passages sealed their fate. 3 minutes later, Yamato rolled completely. And then, a blinding flash. The ammunition magazines detonated in a colossal explosion that ripped the ship into pieces. A mushroom cloud of fire soared thousands of feet into the sky. The blast wave knocked American planes sideways and rocked distant ships. When the boiling smoke drifted away, Yamato was gone. The aftermath. ANERANs. The ocean was quiet again, except for the crackling of burning oil. Bodies floated among shattered metal. Only about 280 survivors were pulled from the sea. Nearly 2,500 men died with Yamato. Several escort vessels were lost as well. The U.S. lost only 10 aircraft, but the greater meaning reached far beyond the numbers. Yamato's destruction marked the symbolic death of the battleship age. For centuries, naval dominance had been defined by gigantic gun-armed ships slugging it out at close range. But the aircraft carrier, mobile, flexible, lethal from hundreds of miles away, had made such giants obsolete. The world had changed. And Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, proved it in fire and ruin. Teach human cost and teach memory. The survivors of Operation Tango were quarantined for over a month after the war, isolated from the public, almost as though the Navy feared the truth they carried. Families waited in agony, not knowing whether their sons and husbands were dead or alive. Rumors spread long before facts did, and many lost hope before confirmations arrived. It wasn't until decades later, in 2006, that over 280 families and surviving veterans retraced Yamato's doomed path, journeying to the coordinates where she fell, 30 degrees 22 N, 128 degrees 04 E. There, they held a memorial over the silent graveyard of twisted steel far below. Today, Yamato rests in shattered pieces across the seabed, a broken titan, a rusting monument to the end of an era, and a reminder of what war ultimately devours: youth, hope, courage, and the belief that any machine is truly invincible. Her story is one of ambition, sacrifice, and the unforgiving arithmetic of modern combat. Japan had poured its pride and industry into building a ship they believed would dominate the oceans. But by the time she sailed on her final mission, The world had already moved into a new age, an age of air power. And on that gray April day in 1945, the sky itself wrote the final chapter in Fire and Steel.